Gabby, we're honored to have you. Thank you for coming on the show. We're excited to chat all things nutrition and gut health with you. I know that I've learned a lot from you just from, I guess to tell everybody that's listening now, I did buy nutrition coaching from you in the past, and you helped me a lot. It was really, really helpful. And it was something that was very, I think, without getting into it, it's like, not that I'm private about it, but it's just like, with gut health, things can get pretty niche and esoteric and weird. So you were quite helpful with that. So I've looked up to you in that realm. And yeah, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. And I'm glad that was helpful. It's always great to receive, feedback from actual clients and,
Sure.
Especially when it's positive.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, that was great. I think it was only 3 months, but it was, and that can be tough with nutrition, as I work with people in nutrition as well. So 3 months can be tough to get things going, but a lot of what I do now personally in my own diet was based off the stuff that kind of you helped me learn throughout that. And I was going through a lot of different avenues, trying to learn different things and seemingly coming to dead ends, which probably pretty common. You probably see that quite a bit. So I was pretty happy about that. So yeah, let's get right into it. We got a list of questions here for you. As people heard earlier, it's going to be all nutrition. That's your specialty, among other things, but specifically gut health as well. That's been pretty trendy, I think, for a little while, particularly on the Instagrams and Facebook and whatever. So kind of to start things off, what is gut health? What does it even mean? And why should we care about it?
That's a good question, because I think it means different things to different people depending on what they're selling or promoting.
True.
So I think what most people mean when they say gut health is probably that there is, an absence of disease in the gut, whether we're talking about, an organic, where we're looking at some disruption in the anatomy and physiology of the gastrointestinal tract, or something that's more functional, where we're just looking at, things look normal, but they may not be behaving in a way that's completely normal. And so we have an absence of disease, and we have effective digestion, absorption, and assimilation of nutrients. We have proper immune function. So we have some level of inflammatory response as appropriate to whatever pathogens might be present. And that we have a diverse microbiome, which refers to the microbes and the genetic material residing in the gastrointestinal tract. And that the gastrointestinal tract is serving as both sort of an assembly line of nutrient assimilation and first line of defense in terms of immune function. Where I think we might go wrong with gut health is that we maybe create or imagine causal relationships where they don't exist. Or we assume that, gut health is sort of the cause of and solution to any problem, from, mental health to eczema to weight management. So that's why I tend to use the term gut health with some trepidation, because it's such an amorphous term that really refers to so many moving parts, that I think we need to sort of break it down and say, are we looking at the anatomy and physiology of the gastrointestinal tract? Are we looking at the form and function of the gut microbiome? Because those are two separate interacting entities. And why should we care about it? Because there's still so much that we don't know, and it's really cool and exciting emerging area of research. Sort of like we're studying the bottom of the ocean, and we're sort of like, oh, like a giant squid died and floated to the top and we found it. That's so cool. Yeah. But we can't assume that we know, more than we actually do, which is not a lot.
Yeah, it seems to be like, from what I've gathered, similar to the world of like psychology, is like we just don't know that much still.
Yes. Oh, 100%.
Yeah. Tough to make, I guess, pretty blanket statements there. You did kind of touch on there with like, I forget what word you used, but basically it was just like inflammatory markers or some type of inflammation response that's expected. And sounds like maybe you're implying even healthy. What is inflammation of the gut? what is that? And like, usually people use that derogatorily or from a negative standpoint or perspective. So,
Right.
what is inflammation of the gut, and do we always want to decrease it, or do we even want, or is that kind of having an inflammation response useful? Kind of similar to like, I don't know, to parallel weight training, right? That inflammation response is helpful for the goal.
Right, exactly. So most of the time when we're talking about inflammation, I think people assume that like inflammation is always a bad thing, that it's always associated with a disease state, and they might be conflating sort of like a chronic inflammatory response with a normal acute immune response. So our gastrointestinal tract, in terms of the anatomy, we have in the large intestine especially a very thick mucus layer. We have it's a bilayer of mucus. The topmost layer of which would be inhabited by microbes. The lower layer should be fairly sterile, and then right beneath that we have the actual cells of the intestinal tract. Those cells are supported by connective tissue, which contains a variety of different immune cells. So those immune cells, some of those immune cells are able to sort of reach into the lumen or the center area of the intestine and look for potential pathogens, interact with the microbes that are present, and then communicate with other aspects of our immune system to say, there's a pathogen here, or hey, everything looks okay. Sometimes our immune systems will get confused and they will mark our native cells, our intestinal cells, as intruders. And then we have an autoimmune disease like an inflammatory bowel disease that causes damage to our own intestinal cells. And that's what we would see with IBD. And in other cases, we might have an allergy. So those cells sense a specific protein in a food and say, oh, this is an intruder, we have to attack this. And then we have an allergic response. So we can have aberrations in the immune or inflammatory response that could be associated with an allergy or disease. But we may have a normal response. We may have a pathogen in the gut and our immune system attacks it, and our native microbes can attack it as well. So there's actually a lot of sort of biochemical warfare that's going on between those microbes as they sort of outcompete each other for nutrients and real estate. And in that case, just like we see that, you know, the acute inflammatory response after exercise is very beneficial, and things like reactive oxygen species are actually used in a defensive manner to help protect us. So we don't necessarily want to suppress all inflammation in the gut. And I think that we're giving ourselves too much credit to even assume that we can have a direct impact on it, you know, in a very acute way with something like diet or exercise. You know, there's a specific anti-inflammatory food we can eat. Or it looks like it's more about lifestyles. It's about entire dietary patterns and physical activity habits that are associated with a normal inflammatory or immune response. And so when we're looking at, you know, markers of inflammation, we might look at specific chemical messengers called cytokines, and those can indicate, you know, whether we're within sort of a normal range of inflammatory tone or whether we've sort of exceeded that. There are products that might come from the gut that could initiate an immune response. And so the one that I studied was LPS, or lipopolysaccharide. So that comes from specific types of bacteria in the gut. And when they die or are destroyed, their cell walls break down, and then they release this LPS, or lipopolysaccharide. And it can escape the gut, but through channels in between the intestinal cells. Now, normally those are held together very tightly by something called tight junction proteins, but in certain disease states, we might see that those junctions open up a little bit. So in individuals with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, for example, that's associated with sort of altered intestinal permeability. Some people call that leaky gut. If the LPS,
I was just about to ask that. Yeah, I was like,
yes,
doesn't
exactly.
that sound like what they call
Yes,
leaky gut?
yes,
Okay.
people say leaky gut.
Yeah, okay.
So the LPS can escape the lumen or the inside of the intestines and go out into the periphery, and it might bind to specific immune receptors that we see sort of in a variety of different tissues. And for example, I looked at skeletal muscle. So when LPS binds to specific receptors on skeletal muscle, that can lead to metabolic dysregulation. So they become a little bit insulin resistant, they don't break down fatty acids all the way, and then we get a buildup of these metabolites that can lead to increased inflammation. And so if we take that, you know, from a mouse model and say, okay, can this happen in humans? Yes, that does translate to some extent, but again, we don't have a causal relationship in humans. You know, we can find sort of like these mechanistic avenues in rodents by like dosing them with LPS. We give them a shot and then see what happens, you know, to their skeletal muscle. Doesn't seem to work quite the same way in humans. And even in the way that we quantify the level of inflammatory markers or the level of this LPS in humans is pretty problematic. So trying to apply that and say like, oh, let's regulate inflammation in the gut, or like, you know, if it's inflammation in the gut that's causing X, Y, and Z problem. I think that's quite often used to sort of like market things more so than it has like a really clinical relevance.
Do you think like kind of what you touched on there at the end too is like the whole a lot of people may also be obviously underqualified and then make the claim, like have the chicken or the egg backwards, where it's like kind of what you said there, where it's they think they should go after inflammation of the gut, which is causing like this like pervasive issue globally or whatever someone's experiencing, subjective symptoms they're reporting. And then, but really it's something else that's like, I guess what you went through, what just talked about there is like, you could have some other issue that this is a totally healthy response. And the reason you have gut inflammation is like, there's something else wrong. And that's the root issue, not the inflammation. You could like, which explains also why, like, I don't know, like I feel just from like personal chats I've had with people, like how many times people that are always trying to decrease or claiming to decrease their own gut inflammation and trying to, they never seem to actually do it. Like they're always, it's this endless cycle of just like failing.
Well, and I wonder too, like what metrics they're using to determine that they have gut inflammation.
It's all field-based scale, right? It has to, like,
because they say their tummy hurts. My tummy hurts, so I must have inflammation, and that's all they can like scale it off of, I guess.
Yeah. I think, you know, it's sort of funny because we go through these like trends, and I feel like inflammation was like a big thing a couple of years ago, like inflammation and adrenal fatigue. And I mean, they're still hanging around, but it's like now we've got like inflammation. Oh, and we can like add it to something else, like inflammation and gut health. And now we have like, and adrenal fatigue, like this whole trifecta of like, let me sell you this problem that I've just created for you.
Right.
Well, speaking of problems, Gab, when you were talking about like gut inflammation and like certain foods, or like what could cause it. So your body goes, hey, I think that's an intruder. And now you obviously have inflammation to try to fight its immune response to said pathogen. You said obviously a lot of people go, this food is anti-inflammatory. Like everyone says, eat blueberries, they decrease your inflammation level. And I would in my head go, well, I mean, food increases acutely inflammation. So I'm like, how would it decrease inflammation? It doesn't make sense to me. Like, can you speak to that a little bit, Gabby? Is there foods that actually I imagine it's like person by person basis, but is there foods that like could help with it? Or is there a lot of foods that are typically inflammatory or like cause too much inflammation, or just kind of go through that?
Well, I think when people say foods are anti-inflammatory, they may be conflating, you know, their antioxidant content and saying that that's anti-inflammatory, or certain constituents within that food may play a role in regulating an inflammatory response in the body, like omega-3 fatty acids. And when we look at, you know, an entire dietary pattern that's high in foods that are high in antioxidants and polyphenols and things that tend to, you know, have a beneficial effect sort of at the cellular level, those dietary patterns may have, I guess we could say, maybe a protective effect, you know, within an entire lifestyle that includes regular physical activity and, you know, limiting or abstinence from things that are known to cause diseases like smoking. So that I think is something that we could say there's an evidence base for making statements about dietary patterns. but not so much just specific foods themselves, like that we have, like, you know, a dose dependent response of like eat this many blueberries per day. Although we can look at, you know, population studies and say, oh, well, it seems like the effective level of blueberries is, you know, people who eat 3 servings of blueberries a week or something like that. That's about as close as we can get. Now, if a person were to eat a food that they have an allergy to, or, you know, if a person with celiac disease eats gluten, then obviously that's going to cause an immune response, and would be more specifically inflammatory. But on the whole, I think when we're looking at just like a person without a dietary, without an allergy, just within their dietary pattern, not to say like one food is going to be causative of inflammation. And really even, you know, like even if we do have altered intestinal permeability, the disease states that correlate with that do not include gastrointestinal distress. So it's sort of funny, like you wouldn't have like necessarily gastrointestinal distress that is a cause of altered intestinal permeability.
Yeah.
And I guess like with the, just on the note of inflammation too, right, is this would obviously be kind of excluding any type of like diagnosable autoimmune disease, right? Because isn't that what like ulcerative colitis and I think we have a question later on regarding like IBS and IBD, but IBS wouldn't necessarily, from my understanding, like have something like that, but just like you could have a diagnosable autoimmune disease that would be like, yeah, you have inflammation, you have legitimate inflammation in your gut. That is the exact problem here.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And even then they don't know anything, like that's diagnosable, but from my understanding too, like they're still so early on that, like all autoimmune diseases, but it's like they still can't really say that much other than like what feels better for you. if lettuce bothers you, maybe stay away or whatever the food is. Yeah, that's all you can go on. So
I mean, that's, you know, pharmaceutical interventions for an autoimmune disease, the inflammatory bowel diseases. So looking at ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, you know, pharmaceutical intervention, and certainly, you know, there are lifestyle factors that again I think would be protective, but we don't have a causal relationship there between the gut microbiome and IBD. Again, it's a chicken or the egg problem. You know, does the disease cause changes to the microbiota or vice versa? And then with irritable bowel syndrome, we don't necessarily see an aberration in inflammatory tone. That's where we get the difference in the types of diseases and really IBS isn't so much a diagnosis of a disease as it is a collection of symptoms that, you know, we've ruled out the diagnosis of any other disease, and now we say, okay, anatomically things are normal, but the function is there's some aberration in function.
Okay. Well, and on that note then, can you explain the difference between IBS and IBD? Because I think people probably use them interchangeably quite a bit. And I think even, people probably talk about IBS the most. From like a blanket statement for like, oh, I have IBS or whatever.
Well, an IBS is much more common. So somewhere in the range, maybe like, I think it's 7 to 15% of the world's population may have.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize it was that high.
It's quite prevalent. And there are 3 forms. So there's IBS with predominant diarrhea. There's IBS and IBS stands for irritable bowel syndrome. So predominantly with diarrhea, constipation, or alternating, so mixed. It's multifactorial. We don't have a clear etiology or cause for it. There are some different theories, and it's probably an interaction of a variety of influences, but there could be some visceral hypersensitivity. So that means that maybe the nervous system of the gastrointestinal tract is very sensitive, and so that causes abnormalities in the contractions of the gut. So we have a few different contractions that are supposed to occur along the gastrointestinal tract. We've got peristalsis, which are these wave-like contractions that kind of squeeze it like a toothpaste tube. And then we have others that sort of help to segment the food and mix it really well. Every several hours, you kind of get a big move it along kind of wave-like contraction. When we eat, we have a gastrocolic reflex, and that causes latter parts of the GI tract to contract and move food through. So we might need to have a bowel movement right after we've had a meal. So those are supposed to happen sort of systematically, and with IBS, there can be some perturbation to those. So we have some really abnormal contractions, or we might have an increased perception of pain in response to normal contractions. So to us, it doesn't feel normal. To us, we perceive it as painful. So there could be some visceral hypersensitivity. There could be that we respond to mechanical stressors around exercise, so the jostling. There are also changes in pH and oxygen levels around exercise that can exacerbate some of the symptoms of IBS as well. And then there are certainly dietary factors as well. So that's where the FODMAP diet comes in. So there are some carbohydrates that are either very osmotically active, so they pull a lot of water in, or they're highly fermentable, so they can create a lot of gas. And that can certainly cause GI distress as well. And then there's a mental aspect as well. So it looks like stress can also exacerbate the symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome. So again, with that, you know, the anatomy, if we were to take a look at someone's GI tract, it would look normal, but the function is different from a person without IBS.
Yeah.
Whereas
Okay.
yeah, and there's not an immune component to that. So it's not that our immune system is playing a role. It's just sort of the function, the movement of the GI tract is different from what we would normally expect. And that's something that they reach that conclusion after they've ruled out, you know, the person doesn't have celiac disease, they don't have Crohn's, they don't have colitis, they don't have anything else going on, then it's IBS. And there are pharmaceutical interventions for IBS that sort of help with either the chronic constipation or the abnormal contractions. And then diet can play a pretty significant role with that. With an inflammatory bowel disease, that is autoimmune. So in that case, our immune system is sort of attacking our intestinal cells. And we would have ulcers, we would have sores along either with ulcerative colitis, it would be along in the colon, the large intestine, or with Crohn's, you get ulcerations along the small and the large intestine. So if you were to look at a person's GI tract who had an inflammatory bowel disease, you would actually see that there is damage to the intestinal lining. And that has an effect on their ability to digest and absorb food. And they would have more significant symptoms. They might have blood in the stool, severe weight loss, anemia, and again, we would have pharmaceutical interventions for that, but we probably wouldn't see that diet plays quite as a significant role as it can with IBS.
Okay, so going back to the different contractions there,
Mm-hmm.
the contractions in the smooth muscle there that should be acting functionally, the way they were designed to, like you said that there could be kind of a glitch in the system potentially maybe, and that's what's causing the issue with like IBS. So that being like a neurological issue potentially, or there's definitely a neurological issue somewhere in there. Like, is it mainly then pharmaceuticals and or lifestyle changes like stress management and stuff like that would, like, how do you retrain the inside of your body neurologically, you know?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that we can so much retrain that as we can more carefully plan nutrition around our exercise bouts, and keep in mind the potential effects of exercise. We also actually, the one thing I forgot to mention, there are changes in symptoms for females around their menstrual cycle as well that might be related to changes in hormone levels. So to some extent, I think, actually to a great extent, I think it's more about kind of like managing it and figuring out what works for a person on an individual level. Keeping in mind, that we're talking about when it's food, we're talking about sort of the chemical composition of foods. It's not anything that's like super like woo woo or anything. It's just, okay, some foods are going to be osmotically active. They're going to pull a lot of water into the gut. Other foods are highly fermentable. They create a lot of gas. And so that's where the FODMAP diet is really helpful, because it classifies the various fermentable forms of carbohydrates and allows people to sort of test that in a systematic way and determine which of these groups are tolerable to them or not, and in what amounts. And so that's sort of the one of the most effective dietary interventions. It seems to really improve symptoms for people with IBS-D primarily, for about 40% of individuals. So that seems to be fairly effective. Some of the drugs, I mean, and this is like getting into an area that is not my forte. I have a working knowledge of it. There doesn't seem to be as many drugs available for chronic constipation. And from what I've seen, they're like super expensive. As far as with the diarrhea predominant, or even maybe with mixed, but the people who have the really severe cramps and things like that, they can take an antispasmodic that seems to help kind of relax some of those aberrant contractions of the GI tract. So that seems to be fairly helpful. But again, I think a lot of it is, and this could be my personal bias, is, looking at lifestyle factors. So how can we modify the diet? How can we manage stress? And then how can we carefully work nutrient timing around exercise to make sure that we're fueled well, but not taking in anything that's going to exacerbate the GI symptoms, that go along with that exercise-induced gastrointestinal syndrome, because that seems to be very common in individuals who are endurance athletes, even if they don't have IBS. It just seems to be like when you're doing a really long run, probably a lot of people, anyone who's done a run for like a long period of time has probably experienced runner's trots. That's like the cute name for like bad diarrhea after you've gone on a long run. So there are, just mechanical and chemo stressors that occur when we're exercising intensely for long periods of time, that seem to, cause some GI distress.
Anyone listening to this podcast is probably being driven nuts, because we always talk about how things are multifactorial and there's not one, there's no panacea, and everyone listening to this is waiting for Gabby to be like, don't eat this, you're good. And it's probably driving a few people nuts, but yeah, it's hard to not ask general questions like that. Like, what do I eat? Tell me right now, Gabby.
Raspberries are the key. They'll save your life.
Well, I mean, I can say, at the umbrella statement that I give people before exercise is to avoid fat, fiber, and well, I used to say fat, fiber, and fructose were the big three, but now I kind of just say like fat and FODMAPs. But people don't really know what FODMAPs are, and there's so many. So if a person really has GI distress around exercise, I'm like, don't eat anything with fiber, no fruits, no vegetables, no fats. Go for something that's like bleached flour, and that's it. And maybe a lean protein if you need it. No dairy. Those things all are you're just going to reduce your chances of taking in something that's going to be fermentable or cause, water pulling into the gut and whatnot. So that's kind of the easiest thing, I think. And I'm sure people who are really carnivore, they're probably like, yeah, fiber's so bad for you. That's not what I'm saying.
yeah, of course.
That's been a good piece of advice for me too, is because I mostly it'll be like chicken and rice or steak and rice almost always before training. Yeah. And I found it's just the best.
Yeah, exactly. Like rice cakes, one of the best things before training.
Yeah.
Nice. You're the first person, Gabby, I've ever seen, you're the first person I came across that talked about macronutrient timing and why it actually would be important, rather than some people just going, get some simple carbs before, and they just say simple carbs. They don't say what to eat, but there is usually a fruit of some kind. Whereas you're saying it's sort of the opposite in a way. And then I never actually thought about having a high fat meal before a workout. I didn't realize how much that could play a factor as well. In other people, I don't really get as much distress as other people clearly have, but I find it interesting with the FODMAP thing. I mean, I feel like you can be an attest to this. A lot of people want to go plant-based, kind of plant-centric to the most, to as much as they can. Yeah. But then from what I understand, my limited knowledge of FODMAP, of course, is that onions and mushrooms are kind of a no-go for the most people, but it's a plant to some degree that people are like, but it's a plant, it's so good for me. Can you speak to that? Why those are deemed bad, or why they shouldn't be?
Yeah, I love that, because it's the idea of something being bad is so subjective, right? So I like to say, and I do this, I mean, this is something that I do with with clients when we're doing cognitive exercises with thoughts, and emotions. Not necessarily that something's good or bad, but is it useful? Is it helpful? Because those I think are better ways to evaluate. Is a Pop-Tart useful? Before a workout? Maybe, sure. great. But if I am looking for something that's going to be like really satisfying and like fill me up for breakfast, not useful. Pop-Tarts are not good or bad. It's just useful or not useful, and then when, in what context. So FODMAPs refer to, the acronym is fermentable oligo, di, monosaccharides, and polyols. And that's basically a fancy way of saying fermentable carbohydrates.
Right.
So all fibers are carbohydrates, not all carbohydrates are fibers, and not all fibers are fermentable. So when we look at the group of FODMAPs, we have fructose, which is a monosaccharide. So it's a one-ring carbohydrate. So that's something that we find in fruits. We do find it in vegetables. Honey is like the most abundant fructose source in the diet. It's actually the test food for fructose tolerance. And the interesting thing about fructose, it's actually universally malabsorbed. Like fructose, because so like if you give any human enough fructose, they'll have GI distress from that.
Okay.
Because so we have two different ways to like get things into a cell, right? We have active transport. So like we can move things, like even if there's a ton of glucose in a cell, we can actively transport it in against its concentration gradient. You know, most things want to go from like an area of high to low, but we can like force it into a cell. Don't have that same thing with fructose in the gut. So fructose kind of has to wait its turn to get into the intestinal cell. And in the meantime, just hanging out in the lumen in the center of the GI tract. And if we don't absorb it, it will just kind of tootle its way along to the large intestine. It can be fermented along the way. It might have some osmotic activity. If the concentration is really high, it pulls a lot of water into the lumen. So it causes GI distress. Mostly you can have like a laxative effect. So fructose is one, lactose is another. So people who have lactose intolerance, so lactose is a disaccharide. So there's two aspects to lactose. So that can get to the large intestine if it's not broken down by us, because we don't have lactase, the enzyme to break it down. That causes gas and bloating. And then we have mannitol. So that's one you mentioned in mushrooms. So it's another one that like we just don't break it down, and so it's fermented. The ones with onion, so onion contains inulin, and so does garlic. So onion and garlic are two of the biggest ones. Chicory root is another one that we find it's a very common additive in a lot of sort of like diet foods because it increases the fiber content. And chicory root is another form of inulin, and inulin is incredibly fermentable, causes a lot of gas and bloating, GI distress. And it's a form of fructan, so it's a long chain of fructose. So a lot of people have a difficult time, even with kind of small amounts of onion and garlic. And then we have the galacto-oligosaccharides. We find those in beans. So like they're the musical fruit, you know, so there's a reason why, because it contains a lot of fermentable carbohydrate. So these are not, again, they're not bad. They're not damaging our intestinal tract in any way. It's just that because we are not digesting them to their smallest constituent parts and then absorbing them into our intestinal cells, they're hanging out in the gut and either pulling water into it, which can have a laxative effect, or they are being fermented. And then we also have the sugar alcohols. So sorbitol is one. So sorbitol is found in a lot of fruits, and it's something that's also used as sort of a low-calorie sweetener. Anything that ends in an -ol, xylitol. I'm trying to think of what else. I think maltitol is another one. Lactitol, not very commonly used. But those things, again, we just don't absorb them, and so they go to the large intestine and they're fermented. The exception to that is erythritol. It's not readily fermentable, but some folks still will get GI distress from it. My guess is because of the osmotic activity. So again, not causing you damage or harm, you know, to your GI tract. They're not necessarily bad. They're great energy sources for the bacteria. So like your microbes are going to be really happy, but they will probably cause you some GI distress. And so the key is just finding the levels that you can tolerate and still trying to maintain a diversity of fiber types. That's the whole idea of the plant-centric idea is not necessarily vegan or vegetarian in my view. It's just that you eat plants, you eat a variety of plants, and you try to eat some plants at every meal, because we don't really know which fiber types are used by what microbe. And so we're like, try it all. Like, we don't know. So throw a bunch in there, and hopefully you're feeding a diverse array of microbes with a diverse array of fiber types.
Yeah, commonly you'll treat people with, like if you're going to put someone on a FODMAP, a low FODMAP diet, you would do some sort of elimination, right?
Yeah.
Like slowly reduce it, or maybe quickly reduce it. I don't know, but.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very careful about saying like treating anything.
Sure. Yeah.
So the idea is to educate people about the most sort of efficacious and safest way of pursuing a low FODMAP change to their diet. So Monash developed this as a 3-phase process, and they have different adaptations depending on sort of like the context of the individual and their diet. But the first phase is to eliminate the moderate or high FODMAP foods that they're eating habitually, and get to and use a very low FODMAP diet. It's not possible to completely eliminate FODMAPs, but to get it to a point where we're sort of below the threshold of FODMAP intake that would cause issues in most people. And then after a few weeks of that, you do a systematic testing process. So you test fructose, and you do that over the course of several days, titrating the amount until you get to a place where you're like, oh, okay, I can't handle X amount of fructose, but I know I can handle less than that. So you find your personal threshold, and you do that for each of the FODMAP groups. So you've got your fructose, lactose, mannitol, sorbitol, fructans, galacto-oligosaccharides. From there, you now know which you can tolerate and to what extent. You go into the reintroduction phase. So you bring in as many of those FODMAP containing foods as you can, because the idea is that we don't want to eliminate them forever, because those are really the key microbe accessible carbohydrates of the diet. And you can think of this just like any ecosystem, or think of it like a fish tank. You know, if like you don't feed the fish, they're going to die off. Some of them are going to eat each other. And then you'll be left with a very, you'll be left with a fish tank that really lacks diversity. And that tends to be, even though that's a kind of a can of worms in itself to talk about diversity, but losing diversity is probably not a great thing, because diversity is the way that our microbes kind of fight off pathogens. They sort of control each other's numbers because they're sensing who's there. And as long as the pathogenic bacteria are sensing that they're few and far between, they won't express virulence factors in most cases. And then they also give rise to a number of genes. So we want some functional diversity in terms of what the microbiome can do, because it serves a role in immune function and, pathogen resistance and energy harvesting from the diet. So as much as we can maintain that dietary diversity, it seems to also maintain diversity of who's there and what they're doing.
That's got to be the toughest part, is like staying below the threshold, but being like, okay, have some of it because it's healthy.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that one of the hardest parts? You probably use that quite often. Would you say, like, you're managing people's or helping them anyway with like managing their own levels of FODMAPs? So it's like, is that challenging, like getting them over the long term to like reintroduce some amounts, and then just because you're almost like, when you're testing, you're kind of constantly they have to go through discomfort to like test every time, right? So
yeah well, I always take a very client-centered approach, and so it's about helping them navigate that process so they can be informed and educated about sort of how Monash intended for it to go down. And in some cases, they don't want to test each group, and so they don't have to. And when it comes to reintroduction, I would say most people are excited to get to a place where they feel more empowered and confident in their food choices. And that there are quite a few people who, they just want to know. It's not necessarily that they expect that they're never going to have GI distress again. I try to make that very clear, that like, this is not you're never, like, you're going to fart again at some point in your life. That's okay. Hopefully I can say that on this podcast, but so
this is a family show, but yeah, it'll be okay. Tyler will bleep that out.
It's an okay F word, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's about helping them really just feel more empowered and confident. And so that if they go out to eat, they know what choices are going to feel best for them. Or if they do have some GI distress, they can say, oh, it's because I ate onions. And I generally also have, like, as we're going through the process, Monash has a really great app. It's not free, it's like $9, but I think it's so worth it. Like, once you've gone through that process, that you have the app there, and you can actually program it to say, like, I'm really great on, fructans are fine, but like sorbitol is just a mess. And so you get this sort of individualized list of, okay, you can have this much jicama, you can have these many spears of asparagus. Like, I had one client recently who looked at the app. They were out to eat and they were like, oh, I can have a quarter of an asparagus spear. Like, that's not the side dish that I'm going to get with my dinner, And so it's just that, it's just having the knowledge. And it seems to really reduce their anxiety around food, and enhances their ability to, use interoceptive awareness to determine like how hungry or satisfied they are. And also seems to really reduce that confusion and discouragement that can kind of lead to like the F-it effect, like, I feel bad, and so I'm going to eat like a bunch of food that tastes good but also makes me feel bad.
Yeah.
And then they can just really enjoy their food more.
Yeah. And I guess that's a win-win from just all areas, because they're decreasing their stress levels, which would have a positive effect probably on their subjective symptoms, and then they're also just wiser with their food choices. So
100%.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Going back to just like general gut health, what if you had to say one thing, what is the most overrated thing in gut health right now? I guess it's not like, maybe it's not as trendy on the social medias as it was, like, but like, I don't know, maybe I'm not following all the right people or the wrong people, maybe, but like, what's the most overrated thing right now, you would say, where you're like, oh my god, like, it was apple cider vinegar probably like last year or something.
Oh yeah, ACV, that still hangs around. I can't, I don't want to say that probiotics are like overhyped, because they do have applications. I would say probably right now the things that frustrate me the most are like digestive enzymes, outside of like pharmaceutical grade. And then like the idea of just like toxins. And then just I think probably the number one is just the term like bad gut health. That means, it means nothing. It literally means nothing. Or like optimize gut health means nothing. It's like saying optimize the weather. Like, whoa, what does that mean? I mean, does everyone want just, a sunny 70-degree day? I don't know. So that stuff gets me frustrated. And it's something I don't even, like, when people come to me and they're like, I want to get my gut health right. I, obviously am trying to avoid the writing reflex and whatnot, but I first have to ask them, like, what does gut health mean to you? And what are you experiencing? So yes, we validate someone's experience if they're having GI distress. But I definitely don't make claims about like, we're gonna remodel your gut microbiome. That's just not a thing that we can really claim to do, because we don't know how to do that.
I do find it funny. I do find it funny seeing people on Instagram that have like really no business doing it. And then someone like you, Gabby, they're like, you have your PhD in this stuff and it's coming out of your mouth being like, we really don't know that much. Here's what we do know. And here's from like my personal experience of working for however long, I've like found these kind of things. And here's the science behind that. Again, it does drive a lot of people nuts, but it's true. People just say things just to say it, and it usually sells something, of course, Gabby, is. I imagine that's hilariously frustrating for you. Like everyone taking some sort of probiotic or some green powder or something,
Or these like GI, I did a post recently on like the GI map tests and stuff, like these, microbial analyses tests. I mean, we have like, I don't know, terabytes, hundreds of terabytes of data, thousands of terabytes of data, I don't even know, from the Human Microbiome Project. And like, we still, it's funny because I spoke to Rob Knight, who headed that project, and he said, people are just so hungry for solutions that don't exist yet. We're just not there. And like, we have to be very careful about making it look like we're there, because then once we get there, people are like, you changed your mind. And it's like, no, we actually just didn't know back then.
Yeah.
We were just making stuff up, and we kind of have a better idea now. And it turns out that we were kind of wrong about these things, you know? So it's like, even with something extreme like the carnivore diet, I mean, it looks right now like that's probably not a good idea long term, but we might find something out that's pretty cool. Like, I mean, there's new research coming out on the ketogenic diet. It specifically, beta hydroxybutyrate suppresses levels of bifidobacteria, which is probably a bad thing. But it also seems to regulate T cells, which could potentially be beneficial. So I think we have to be careful about, like, you know, making, you know, black and white absolutist statements and whatnot. But yeah, that's my little, I don't know, I went on a tirade there, but
Good.
Oh, that's what we want.
Yeah, we
this
got
is
it.
juicy content, Gabby. This is exactly what I want.
Would you say that, like, going off on that, like, a lot of these interactions, we brought up social media a few times, a lot of these interactions and things we see are over the internet now, right? And you obviously have a accounts on social media, so you'll attempt to purvey, you know, like, good, healthy information. But there's a lot of people out there that aren't. Like, would you say that social media is a net positive or a net negative, like, so far on maybe just nutrition and gut health in general right now? Because, like, it's really not, I mean, here, I'll just say right now, I think it's a net negative. And that may be, there's some selection bias there, which is like what I see and whatever else. But, like, my experience has been, like, it would be much harder for me to find people like you on the internet than people like bleep, you know, but whatever. But yeah, like, I mean, it's pretty easy to find, like, I'm a carnivore, by my PDF ebook, whatever, you know, like.
Yeah. I would say right now, it's not very helpful, to go back to my
nice
useful and helpful. I would say that social media is not very useful and helpful right now in disseminating quality evidence-based information. And part of that is, I think there's even I can't remember who, there was a researcher out of Cork, I want to say. They do some really incredible, in Ireland, they do some incredible research in the gut microbiome. And it was the keynote speaker at the Gut Microbiome for Health Symposium in Madrid at the beginning of the year. And he had this really excellent talk it was candid about the significant limitations in the realm of gut microbiome research right now. Like, the reproducibility is a huge issue. We don't have a lot of, like, sort of gold standard techniques for analyzing the taxonomic diversity. The way that we represent the data, the graphical representations, are beautiful and quite often incomprehensible, because we're trying to represent three-dimensional data on a flat piece of paper. And, you know, and we're using, you know, like, heat maps and things that are, like, we're trying to, like, quantitatively represent qualitative data. I mean, it's just, you know, so these are significant shortcomings, but they're, I think, not made very clear, even in, like, limitation sections of papers. And, you know, some of the questions that you had posed about, like, the kind of the reproducibility or translatability of rodent models. You know, rodent models can provide us mechanistic data, but they can't be used to translate to human microbiota. It's just not, like, it's not a real world microbiota that we have in a rodent. The closest thing we might be able to get to would be, like, a pig gastrointestinal tract, but that's just really not done very often. So when people are trying to make claims about, like, you know, the link between the gut microbiome and mental health, and they're looking at, like, rodent models, and they're like, oh, you know, it can affect mood. I don't know, do mice have moods? Like, I mean, really, you know, can we talk, like, I at the very least, I think we have to say, like, you know, the murine or mouse model of gut microbiome and brain development and how that might lead to mouse behavior. give me that. Okay, we can like take that. But like, don't say that we can translate that to human mood. Like give human brains a little more credit in their complexity, right? So yeah, so I think that that's where it's like, even we can't look at someone just using references and say that's evidence-based. I think the person has to have an understanding of the techniques used in collecting that data and how it's represented and what it really means, and you know, using their expertise in that area plus the data, that I think could be evidence-based. But there's so many just bad articles out there on PubMed and things that we can look at in cell culture, and say like, oh, you know, artificial sweeteners cause this and that and the other thing, because we looked at it in, you know, just a mouse model or cell culture, and then tried to translate that to the human gut microbiome.
Right.
Yeah. Aren't those studies like heroically high doses of aspartame and stuff like that, where it's like some crazy thing that you could never take in that much artificial sweetener that they gave to the mouse, and it caused like XYZ, and everyone's like, see, causes cancer, and you're like, well, how about you just want to be like, you're dumb, and no, but it's hard to you bite your tongue, you're like, I'm nice.
Yeah, I mean, I try to, you know, I pick my battles.
Yes, as you should, Gabby, it's easier said than done, because I have a general rule of thumb now, which is obviously there's exceptions to every rule, but if an Instagram looks really beautiful and it's just like amazing and like it's probably not the greatest information out there, because the person is just like selling you some weird thing.
That is a good rule.
The only exception is Hannah Moves in the pain science realm. He's I don't know, he must have been a graphic designer before he's a physio. It's beautiful, but he's like, I think he's the only exception to the rule. But you know, and your Instagram is nice though, Gabby, too, as well. Like it is digestible, and your captions, even though quite lengthy, it's good because it actually breaks it down instead of being like artificial sweeteners are bad. There's no a
beautiful red X in a green check mark.
Yes.
Like, so aesthetically pleasing.
Oh, I'm glad you think so, because it's funny, I think there's like a 50-50 split. Some people are like, wow, where do you make your graphics? And like now I've come into the world of Canva, so I'm like, I've graduated.
Oh, nice.
But like I was like, they're PowerPoint slides that I saved as a JPEG. And then other people are like, do you need any assistance with like creating graphics? And I'm like, I'm here to convey information. Like I realize that looks like a PowerPoint slide because it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
but I guess like it depends on what like I guess that's the paradox of it, is like you probably do want to attract more people that wouldn't know this stuff. Like, I don't know how, I mean, I definitely learn a lot of stuff from your posts that you put out there, but like it may actually be like a larger net positive if you converted someone, you know, than like, I'm already I'm already with you, you know?
Yeah.
So
I mean,
it's like, that's the tough part with social media, is you want to make it like somewhat salacious, be like, hey, this is attractive, check this out, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. To make it more attractive and eye-catching and palatable. And you know, I can say, I think that I haven't like offended anyone to the point that like they got defensive and like turned off. You know, I think for the most part, people are at least like curious, or they are a little bit doubtful, but also kind of like, what's going on here? You know, and I try, and I'm not really even out to like change anyone's mind,
right?
You know, I mean, if their minds change, that's awesome. But I think that's one of the big things. Like, I'm not trying to sell anything either. I've like made a pact. I don't affiliate with anyone, even though I would love to be able to affiliate with Monash just so I could like give people a discount on the app. But I don't want people to think that I'm like, yay, FODMAP, because I'm an affiliate with Monash.
Totally.
So, you know, I'm kind of like, that's just my thing. I try to like have a lot of integrity and not promote and sell stuff.
Yeah.
Which is kind of sad, because like you do believe in it, obviously. I mean, like, it's sad that you have to think of it that way, where you should be able to be like, I just want to give you guys a discount on this. Like, I think this helps a lot of people. And if it doesn't, sorry, you wasted $6 instead of $9, or like, you know, it's so crazy when you have to break it down like that. But yeah, I feel your pain. That's brutal. Yeah, it is terrible.
I did want to talk about like when you're talking about mood and stuff, you know, just that link between mental health and gut health. There's a lot of maybe claims around there. I know that, what's the book called? Master Your Mind, or there's some book out there that's a little woo woo where it's like something about like, there's probably some good stuff in it, but it's something about controlling your mind and then the effects it has on your gut and stuff like that. And obviously we know that there is a level of like, I think the causal claims in that are probably a little bit outlandish, but it's just the underlying ideas are probably useful to some degree as far as like managing stress and improving your skills at that. But I did want to ask, like, what are your thoughts on the conversation surrounding like the chicken or the egg on the relationship between mental health and gut health? Because like I think you could make, well, I don't know, the argument either or, like where is the root cause? Of course, there's contextual factors with everyone, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what we've found so far, I mean, when they're talking about trying to find like a root cause and say like, oh, the gut microbiome, must cause this. I mean, they're looking at individuals with autism, and psychosis, schizophrenia, depressive disorders. They take mice without microbiome, so they're germ-free mice, and then they like rear them in a sterile environment and see how they develop. And they don't. I mean, they have across the board developmental delays. They are resistant to weight gain. So clearly, like having a microbiome is essential in development. But beyond that, trying to determine in a human model a causal and directional relationship is at this point pretty much impossible. We do know that there's a connection. So there's bidirectional communication, both kind of centrally via the vagus nerve, and then peripherally there are neurotransmitters that may cross the blood-brain barrier or may go through circumventricular organs, so they can get in the brain in different ways. But there are transmitters like serotonin. So there's a gut-derived serotonin, and then there's a brain-derived serotonin. Two discrete pools. They have two different functions, but people kind of conflate those and say like, oh, the gut must affect mood because we produce serotonin in the gut. So there's, I think, just a lot of confusion and just a lot that we don't know, because even human psychology itself is so complex. And now we're adding this incredibly complex ecosystem of organisms and trying to come up with, a causal relationship. It just is not there. But of course, there is a relationship. There is a connection. And even things like so cognitive behavioral therapy, hypnosis, and even yoga seem to help with some of the symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome. And quite often, like stress seems to exacerbate some of the symptoms of IBS. But I think we also have to look at like what else is going on in someone's life when they're super stressed out. How's their diet changing? How's their physical activity level changing? And then, how is that affecting the physiology of the gut? But even that is separate from the gut microbiome. So we may have changes in the functionality of the GI tract without necessarily changes in the gut microbiome. Right. So again, it's a very muddy picture, and we just have to kind of wait and see how technology improves so that we can actually get a sense of how the microbiome is changing in terms of who's there and what they're doing. And then, you maybe marrying that with like brain scans to look at, brain activity and things like that. But so far, the mechanistic studies that we have in rodents, they're not really intended to like recapitulate actual human experiences. It's just trying to figure out like, well, what happens if we have, no microbiome? What happens if we have just specific bacteria? Or, can we humanize mice? And they have done that. So they've humanized mice. They've given them fecal transplants from humans or from other mice. And they found that, with transplants, we tend to see differences in mouse behavior. Yep. But again, I don't think that we probably should translate that to human mood and behavior.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Like, I don't know what the exact percentage is that is actually true or what they said, but just for the sake of the sentiment here, it's like I've heard many people state before where it's like, 80% of your serotonin is made in your gut. And then you're like, wow, that's so interesting. And then you're like, so what?
Yes.
Like, what do I do about this? Like, I guess drink less alcohol, you know, just do all the things I should be doing, you know,
Mhm.
eat more plants. I don't know,
Yeah,
stress
I'm
less,
like,
relax,
yes.
man. Like,
Yeah. And it's like, even if like what if your gut microbiome just didn't change at all? What if you just did this stuff anyway
yeah,
because it seems to be protective against disease and it makes you feel better? And the gut
yeah,
microbiome is just going to do whatever it does, because in our
right.
longitudinal studies, it looks like it kind of just does whatever it does. And even if we do an intervention,
Yeah.
after some time, the gut microbiome kind of just like goes back to the way it was.
Well, I was going to say, like, do you think like most of
Wow.
that is just like, for lack of a better term, maybe just like genetically predetermined anyway? It's just like, you know, it's like, this is the way it is. And like you trying to change it is like going to take some weird robotic Kardashian level surgery to like, you know, like your structure is this, stop
Mhm.
screwing with it, you know?
Yeah,
Because yeah, all you can do is make good choices. Kind of like, I mean, actually to use that as a parallel, it's like, you want a bigger butt, you can just keep squatting, you know?
yeah,
And then however you're shaped, you can just maximize that. So
yeah.
kind of like, yeah, do all the
Mhm.
things you should be doing for gut health. And then, you know, that you're, you know, maximizing, or at least making the most out of what you can do for healthy choices regarding that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I've always sort of thought of it like when someone has like some sort of an irritable bowel and they're not happy and they try to assimilate gut health and mental health together. I would just think like if you start to eat differently for you and you would feel better, and you're like not as constipated, not looking for the bathroom every 5 minutes when you're out with friends, not in some physical distress, actual pain, I think your mood would increase. So like rather
Oh
than
yeah.
the actual changes going on physiologically, just the mental of like, yeah, my body actually feels better and I don't have to worry about pooping my pants in front of all my friends. I feel like that
Hmm.
would definitely like, that would make my mental health better, not worrying about shitting in front of Tim, you know? So it's, so
This is a
with all
family
that
show.
being
You're going to
said,
have to bleep that out.
oh, I will, I'm sorry. So,
Just
but
kidding.
like you were just saying, I mean, like, it's just like, yeah, we can, obviously you're clearly obsessed with the science, but like, even you were just like, try to eat better for you and you'll feel better and your mental health will get better. So like rather than this, you know, giving them a specific thing, other than the people that you work with, I imagine you go a little bit more in depth, which shameless plug for you right now, definitely contact Gabby if you have any sort of distress. Again, with Tim's anecdotal evidence before, like you helped him through his time, that he's not afraid to say that it really, really helped him, his mood
Oh,
and
yeah.
everything. So
Highly recommend. Yeah, no, that was a positive experience. And it was the FOD, to kind of touch on it briefly, it was um from what you kind of led me to figure out on my own, which was I have some type of issue with fructose at lower levels than most, maybe.
Hmm.
So now I just basically manage my fructose intake, and there's probably other FODMAPs that I definitely have problems with, but like fructose was the biggie, where it was
Hmm.
like, oh yeah, decrease that. And then it's like everything else just kind of self-corrected. And my gut microbiome is probably super weird. I don't know, but I don't know because I haven't tested it.
Yes, and it wouldn't
Yeah,
even matter anyway. It's like I
right,
could,
right.
when I look at people, you know, people, I've had clients that have gotten like those GI map tests or whatnot, but
Yeah.
I'll like, you know, get an idea of their diet ahead of time. And
Mhm.
I'm like, oh, you're probably going to have, you know, we're going to have, because we've got like 4 main phyla. So these are like, the classifying is like vertebrates versus invertebrates. I mean, it's very,
Mhm.
very general. And like most of the bacteria fit in with those. And we've got some like key players that most humans have a lot of, and some will go up or down in response to dietary extremes because they're finicky. So if I've got a person who has been following like a keto or carnivore diet, I'm like, oh, you're probably going to have a lot of Bacteroides and like lower level of bifidobacteria than a person who eats, you know, a lot of carbohydrates. And but it's like, but does it actually matter? We
Yeah.
don't know, because we don't know the clinical outcomes or the clinical relevance of these differences. And we don't see consistent differences even in individuals with the same disease or even
Yeah.
in individuals with the same diet, you know, because like you referred to earlier, there is a genetic component to it. So that's why, like, that's part of the reason why a mouse microbiome will look like a mouse microbiome and a human microbiome will look like a human microbiome, because we have differences in the genetic component and in anatomy and physiology of the GI tract that changes their environment. And so that really is going to dictate what population grows there, you know? So you like your GI tract, your genes, the receptors that you express, that's going to, and your immune cells, that's going to interact with and influence the shape of your microbiome and where you live, and whether you were vaginally or C-section born, and whether you were breastfed or bottle fed. I mean, there's so many factors that go into the shape of your microbiome. It is individual as a fingerprint. If we could really analyze yours down to, you know, the subspecies level, we'd be able to be like, that's Tim's. And then like Tyler, we'd be able to identify yours looks different.
Right.
But it's just like, how does it matter? Like, and can we really change it?
And then you'd run some experiments on it, figure out some cool outcomes, then be like, you're a clone. Oh, wait, there's only one of you. We have to test everyone to get, damn it. None of this matters. This is so hard to do.
I like what you just said earlier was so revolutionary. A mouse is a mouse and a human is a human. I think a lot of people in the scientific community could actually use that knowledge, and probably stop spewing some stuff that they have been when they like use mouse models as it's like, it's directly correlated to humans. You're like, we just did it on a mouse because we can't really do it on humans. We're not legally allowed. So yeah, to try to like extrapolate all that results and go like, this is exactly what it is for humans. So it is actually revolutionary, even though it sounds very like 3-year-old-y. Human is a human, mouse is a mouse.
Yeah. Always comes back to the simple.
Right. Yeah. I try to make that clear. Like the stuff that I share, I'm writing a book for RP. And I say like, hey, in rodents, this is what we found. In humans, we found this other stuff. So, you know, or in rodents, this is what we found. We haven't done this yet in humans. So we don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very true.
Gabby, I did want to ask you one more thing, just touch a bit on like disordered eating stuff. Cause I think that's kind of like the obvious, I don't know, probably most, I don't know if it's safe to say all, but it probably is. Like everyone has some level of weird eating patterns that they do or bad habits, you know, and I know that most people do know that disordered eating isn't terribly uncommon in the fitness industry, and just athletics in general. I wanted to know, what are some of your strategies that you would commonly use with clients to help them kind of reorganize their behaviors around eating and try and kind of eschew some of those disordered eating patterns that they've learned, you know, over the years, maybe through sport or just throughout their childhood?
Yeah. I mean, that's a big one. So I was just on a podcast yesterday and he asked me like, what is coaching? And I said, I think that my definition of coaching is to help people decide what they want to do and then help them do the thing they want to do. And one of the central tenets of acceptance and commitment therapy, which is something that we borrow, I've been working with Shannon Beer and Dan Feldman in our comprehensive coaching framework, and we kind of sprinkle in some of the aspects of acceptance and commitment therapy. And one of the central tenets to that is like, are your behaviors useful? And are they workable for you? So do they work for you within your life, taking you in the direction of your values and the identity of the person that you want to be? So if a person comes to me and feels uncomfortable, feels out of alignment with their behaviors around food, we look at their relationship with food. And I've defined that, which is not a technical definition. It's just something that I think works, that a person's relationship with food, it's really about their relationship with themselves and how that manifests in their behaviors around food. So if a person has beliefs about themselves, that they are out of control around food, that they can't be trusted, that they have trigger foods, they've given power to a specific food, and they may restrict and then binge and sort of go through this cycle. And it doesn't feel good for them long term. It's just not workable. They feel stuck. They are struggling. They're frustrated. They want to have autonomy in their choices. They want to feel like they can be in charge of however much of that food they eat and feel good about it. And so I help them get to that place. And it's going to look different, you know, from person to person. There's not a one size fits all. And even, you know, when we look at things like weight neutral approaches, or people talk about like intuitive eating, you know, it's about much more than food. I would say that most people have a great amount of nutritional IQ already. Like they know what carbs and proteins are. They know about energy balance. They don't necessarily know how to get themselves to a place where they can like be around cookies and ice cream and things like that and just like eat a comfortable amount that feels good and like move on with their day. And so we talk about their beliefs about themselves and beliefs about foods, and sprinkle in a little bit of, you know, of my expertise, my nutritional knowledge that supplements their journey. But a lot of it is just helping them to learn about themselves and challenge some of those beliefs that are not useful for them. Not that there's anything necessarily bad. It's just, is it useful? Is it helpful? And then can we challenge that? Can we change that? And how might we, you know, inform your future behaviors so that you can behave in a way around food that you want to behave in, and have that be workable and sustainable for you long term.
That's amazing. Did you know before you got it, like started nutrition coaching, did you have any idea how much you would be kind of using different motivational interviewing techniques and helping people with behavior change?
It's so funny because I actually first started with motivational interviewing when I was still teaching. So, but it wasn't motivational interviewing then, it was appreciative advising, which is sort of the educational version of MI, where you help students identify their strengths and their capacity for change and pursue goals. I didn't quite understand like what it was at the time that I was trying to do or what I was doing. It wasn't until I started, you know, I started coaching, and then I was like, you know, how can I better help people? And this was just like when I was doing 100% email coaching. You know, it was like, how do I really help people like make change? Because it seems like people pretty much know, and it's not enough for me to give them this template, you know, like the nutrition plan. Their problem isn't not having macros. They can look that up on a calculator.
Yeah.
Their problem is, you know, their struggle is, how do they stick to this? Or how do they have, you know, date nights? How do they have a birthday party and eat cake and then like feel okay with it and go on about their day after that? So I really didn't anticipate that. And then it was when I got my health coach certification and I really started learning, you know, and reading more about MI. And then I did an MI CEU course, and was just like, I think I've been kind of like obsessed with it since then. And it's not a panacea. I mean, it's not like the only thing that you always use. It's just a very effective way of being with someone and having a conversation with someone. And that even if you don't walk through with them, you don't guide them through a whole stage of changing their lifestyle, just giving them that space, that non-judgmental, safe space to talk and be accepted and be regarded with positivity and appreciation and affirmation for their strengths. Just that alone is huge. I mean, just that space is something that so few people, I think, really get to experience. That's something that I didn't really anticipate. And that has really flourished in the time that I've done my own stuff. I mean, I still do that via email as much as I can, but in starting my telehealth business, that was at the beginning of last year. So being able to have that face-to-face video conversation with people, that's really where this has come into play to a far greater extent. And then with like the comprehensive coaching model, I mean, it's been really amazing and just like this wonderful organic evolution of this coaching model that I mean, I didn't think that it was going to, you know, and I'm only saying, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I'm just like, the feedback that I'm getting from clients, I'm like, holy crap, really? Like this, so glad that it's helping you that much.
Yeah. That's always nice to hear, for sure. Right. Like, I mean, I guess, like you said, it's not a panacea, but it's just another tool that you can use. And, you know, at the very least, and you kind of said it more eloquently, but it would just make you a more empathetic coach and guide, right? Like it just, yeah, maybe you don't always use it all the time, but it's something that's probably always present to some degree, you know, when you're interacting with clients and helping them kind of figure out their own things. Yeah. The with the macro thing, it's like it just made me think of an interaction I had with someone briefly recently, where it was over the internet, and I shared usually like interesting situations with weight loss clients. I will share that. I'd be like, oh, this is common, this could be useful, and then I comment on it and be like, this is what's happening, this is what we're doing, whatever, right? Because someone could read it and be like, that's interesting to me, or I've experienced that, I wondered what you would do there. So I'll share those things sometimes. And I shared one where someone was having an issue where they were they'd done fantastic so far, but they came to a normal plateau, which happens. And I knew what the game plan was. I knew what we were going to do. They knew what they were going to do, but I shared it on social media, and I forget what the comment was, but I remember someone responding and being like, what did they say? Looks like you need to drop their macros. I was like, yeah, they need to eat less. Yeah. They know that. It's like, yeah, they do. Like, as if like, I mean, and to like give this person, to be fair, like I don't train. I just help Gen Pop. Like I'm not helping any athletes or this person was a former bodybuilder. So they're used to just like having those type of prep coaches that are, you know, moving numbers around and stuff. And like, that's what they need or whatever. Right. But that's totally different than what I was doing. And I was like, yeah, these types of, like, the people I'm working with don't need that. They know that they need to eat less. I just need to help them help themselves eat less.
Right.
Like, so.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, we're going to wrap up the show. Tyler has a question that we didn't put on here. And we never do because it's scary. And no, I'm just kidding. Don't be nervous. But he asks every guest this at the end of the show. So
I'll preface it first, Gabby. It doesn't have to, your answer to this question doesn't have to be about anything we've talked about. It can be anything. Okay. So if you could tell every person on this planet one thing, what would you tell them?
Because everyone on this planet is listening to this podcast, obviously.
Everyone on this planet, something.
All 7 of
them. Man, this is hard because I like never deal in, only a Sith deals in absolutes.
True.
Yeah. Oh man. You know, I feel like so I have to preface this statement because I was just listening to a podcast on motivational interviewing from Steve Rolnick. He's one of the like main researchers, and he, you know, and the presenter asked him, so do you think that like every person on the planet, you know, is basically good? Are all humans basically good? And they, you know, they have the capacity for good. And I thought Rolnick was probably going to say like, probably, yeah, because it's kind of like a positive psychology thing, but he was like, no. He said, you know, I think that we start off probably with that capacity, but we're so vulnerable to hate that we can't say that most people are basically good. So I want to say that I think that most people have the capacity to change. I don't know if I could say that to everyone on the planet, but I want to tell most people that they have the capacity to change.
Beautiful.
Love it.
Super well said, Gabby. Yeah, that's awesome. But we got like so many different answers to that question, because some people will be like, eat your veggies or what. It's just like, so much. So I like when someone gets a little bit more insightful, a little bit more introspective. So I really appreciate that answer. That was great.
Awesome.
That was really nice. Well, Gabby, I can't thank you enough for coming on. I'm glad Tim could set this up. This has been amazing. This is obviously, we could have talked for many hours, and I'm sure you could have, you know, regaled us with a ton of tales and more answers to our questions that I'm sure you've gotten a million times. But again, just like to thank you for coming on the show. And obviously feel free, definitely plug your stuff, Gabby. We'll have it in the show notes and on everything on YouTube and on whatever platform someone is listening to this on. But can you give everyone kind of like where to contact you, where to find you, that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So Instagram and Facebook at Vitamin PhD. Also plug my Bridging the Gap and Comprehensive Coaching collaborators at Shannon Beer _ and then Dan Feldman, you can find him at Powerlifter Dietitian. And my website is vitaminphdnutrition.com. We also have btgcomprehensivecoaching.com, where we have our articles, our webinars, and future content coming up. So our webinar, our first installation of our 3-part webinar series drops this Saturday, the 12th, whenever this one's going to be posted. And then we've got our small group sessions coming up in October. And we're definitely going to be putting this on again because this model is iterative. So we change it as needed based on new evidence. So yeah, just absolutely feel free to reach out. And then obviously, you know, I'm also an RP coach. So if they want to do some, you know, one-on-one email coaching, which is separate from the telehealth, then that's an option too.
Nice. Beautiful. That's awesome, Gabby. Well,
We're signing
Tim,
off. Yeah, Gabby, thanks so much for coming on. We'll do this again sometime. And yeah, everyone can find your info in the show notes below. Thanks everyone for listening. Me, Tyler, Gabby, we're out.
See you.